Welcome to another episode of Perspectives on Tyranny, a podcast of Regimes Museum based in Orange County, California. On today's episode, we speak with Dr. Ian Garner, a historian and analyst of Russian culture and war propaganda based in Ontario, Canada. His most recent book, Z Generation, Into the Heart of Russia's Fascist Youth, traces the evolution of Russia over the last 30 years, from its brief window of liberalism, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, to the rise of Vladimir Putin and the country's embrace of militarism, leading up to the invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. Garner's book provides us a glimpse into the outlook of ordinary Russians who came of age during a time of smartphones and social media. Rather than embrace liberal democracy and an open society marked by a free exchange of ideas, these younger Russians, whose entire worldview has been shaped online, have turned increasingly radical and militant, embracing authoritarianism and violence. The war in Ukraine for them has become something to rally around, to pour their identities into, and a chance for the regeneration of Mother Russia. In this episode, Garner and I discuss how Russia arrived at this point and where we in the West have been going wrong in our approach to this issue. Hope you enjoy. Anyways, well, thank you for joining me. I read your book, Z Generation, as we say here in California, or Z Generation. I don't know if I would file it under a leisure read, but I certainly found it fascinating. Because when we talk about Russia in any context, it's usually Putin or as it concerns Ukraine. And, unless we're fluent in Russian or in academia, we don't really have insight into what's transpiring in the cultural realm. And so that's why your book was helpful for understanding that. I was just curious, how did you get people to open up to you? Because Russians aren't exactly known for their openness to outsiders.
Well, it was extremely hard. I spent a lot of time sort of following this slightly anthropological course of hanging out in these deep, dark corners of the Russian internet, absorbing the culture there, seeing who was posting, how the dynamics were in different groups and different communities. And then I approached people. I probably sent out, I don't know, something like 500 to 600 inquiries. And probably half of the people that I emailed or messaged got back to me in some way or another, which is actually a pretty good response rate. If you look at social sciences research, that's actually not bad. Where I ultimately conducted 50 or 60 interviews, something in that region for the book, as well as including this sort of anthropological observations about what it is like to be involved in these online communities of hatred and nationalism that seem to be sucking young people in. But what was really interesting was that it was very hard to get those who are opposed to the regime to talk. Unsurprising in a sense, because they're worried that they're going to get in trouble. They're very suspicious that this is a trick, that, the FSB, that is the security services, are always watching. But it was very easy to get the nationalist crowd talking. There is really a sense they have that they're sort of pumped up with enthusiasm. They have the language, they have the sound bites they want to use. In their minds, everything is really clear. And they want to go out and tell the world, you're being lied to, we're the good guys. It's you that doesn't understand that what we're doing in Ukraine is right, that what we're doing at home, which is violent and brutal and oppressive, is the right thing to do. And so it was surprisingly not that difficult to get people to engage.
How did you develop a framework for understanding what's going on while avoiding some of the pitfalls of imbuing too much logic on their outlook, their narrative?
So, I mean, this comes from, at the risk of getting super academic, this comes from my background from my PhD and from my first book, which was about memories around the Battle of Stalingrad. And I'm really interested in the scholarship of Soviet and Russian subjectivity. That is, how people absorb and use the language of power, how they often don't recognize that they're speaking the language of power, but simply, if you look through statements, for example, from the 1930s, you will find people that were victims of the Stalinist terror using often unwittingly phrases that are drawn from propaganda. And they would say, I'm an opponent of the regime, and they also talk the language of the regime, which is a fascinating thing, right? And therefore, I thought this framework translated very well to what we're talking about in the present, talking about young Russians. There's a huge amount of data available publicly on the internet because much of this scholarship has been done with diary writing in the past and letter writing, which is, all sort of hidden away. But today, when you want to find out how a teenager or a young person is documenting their life and constructing an identity for themselves, well, people have social media pages. And that's, if you can find me a 17-year-old who is writing a diary nowadays on paper, I'm sure there are some, but not many. But what you do have is a TikTok feed or an Instagram feed where they're constructing this sense of here's what I am. And of course, there is a really interesting twist there in that this is semi-private and semi-public at the same time. So there are some differences.
You dispelled fascism, or as it concerns Russia, into these distinct elements. The following key themes, so this is my takeaway. You analyze it through language, spectacle or symbolism, nostalgia, violence, patriarchy, regeneration through war, and sort of cleansing or rebirth. As it concerns nostalgia, I want to touch upon the idea of contradiction, as you just mentioned. Fascism versus communism. Let me read you a passage from your book. Youth online might lust after Soviet aesthetics in everyday life. They might consume old TV shows and join Soviet core nostalgia groups online. But they, like the state's propagandists, roundly mock Marxist ideology. So someone not as well versed in this, they might say, well, isn't fascism right-wing? Why would a culture that's drifting rightward be nostalgic for something like the Soviet Union? How do we make sense of that contradiction?
It's hugely contradictory on the surface. And ultimately, when you look at ideologies of fascism, whether modern or from the mid-20th century, you're looking at something that has never been logical. There is no rationale really behind it. The logic is completely flimsy. And you look back at Nazism, and there was really, it's a sort of collection of random philosophical ideas tacked together with rusty old nails, and the second you poke it, it all falls apart. But there is no contradiction here, because fascism lusts after the recreation of a lost time. Make Russia great again. There was some point in the past when Russia was this great and powerful nation, but that past has been lost. It's now, the body politic is diseased, it's degenerate. We're being infected from the outside by non-Russian cultures, and some of this language will sound perhaps very familiar and close to home for some of the audience here. But it's about the recreation of a lost time that never existed. And so in Russia, I think in the West, we have a real preoccupation with the ways in which the Russian state and the Russian public are engaging with the Soviet past, because it's very visible to us and we recognize those symbols. But alongside the symbols of the Soviet past, we also see the symbols of the Tsarist past, right? And those two things can't go together. And you will find genuinely nationalist groups. If you look at the Youth Army, this paramilitary youth group that the Russian state has funded, the regalia, the insignia, sums up memories of the Soviet pioneers, and yet the logo looks like the old Russian imperial eagle. There is a complete contradiction here that has been plastered on the heads and chests of 1.5 million Russian kids right now. These things go together because you're not reaching for a time that is real. You're reaching for an imagined sort of projected past in which Russia was great. And you might argue that Russia was great under the Russian Empire, under the Tsars. It could have been great when it was in charge of the Soviet Union. Equally, it's great, and this is something that was very little talked about in the West, in a sort of mythical medieval period that has less to do with the real past and history and more to do with folklore and sort of, knights errant, Arthur and the Round Tables kinds of myths and legends. All these things are thrown together into this big cement mixer of meaning and tossed around. And then people just pull them out again and say, this is what I imagine Russia is and could be.
So it's not necessarily this desire for some proletariat revolution. It's the grandeur of the Soviet Empire and the time.
Absolutely not. And Putin's famous quote from back in 2005 is that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. And yet even Putin and nobody around him in the Kremlin is seriously suggesting bringing back the study of Marx into the school curriculum, even though they've completely torn up and reinvented the school curriculum over the last 10 years. Marx doesn't come into it, not even a shade of Marxism, even if he's not named. Nobody's interested in that at all. We have sort of hyper-capitalism, something that was completely chaotic, and sort of Wild West capitalism bolted onto this nostalgia for the past. And that is much more reminiscent of the fascist movements of the past than of communism.
One of many things that stuck out to me was how much young people are taking up this mantle, particularly from groups you wouldn't expect to be so hyper enthusiastic for the state. For instance, punk rockers and hipsters. Let me read you a passage. Even punk rock fashion students weren't rebelling. They were showing their peers that there could be nothing better than acting, playing, and singing your love for the state's military men. Punk rock and nationalism, you don't typically see those in the same vein. Help me wrap my head around this.
I mean, we're certainly not talking about a sort of really rebellious punk rock like you might imagine the old punk rockers from the 70s and 80s in the West. We're talking about a Russia in which young people are allowed to experiment with different aesthetic forms, different music, different very superficial forms of identity. And sometimes this looks highly chaotic. Young people are allowed to, and this passage refers to the Moscow Art Industrial Institute, which is, and I think that's the translation I used in the book, which is a private university for mostly art students. The industrial in the name doesn't really have anything to do with it. They're art students. They have this sort of slightly neo-fascist military group that is a core part of the university. It's almost the emblem of the university. The logo of the group is a skull and crossbones. Like good fashion students, they like dressing up and they redesign the uniform constantly. And you'll have these guys that are proper hipsters, big beards. They have those, what are they called, like the spacers in their ears. They're listening to rock music. They're making their own rock music, but wearing these really sort of ornately produced, aesthetically, like often quite clever and well-designed uniforms that they've made themselves. And then the female students, everything is highly gendered, of course. It's very traditional in terms of gender outlook. The female students, very short skirts, beautiful makeup, and very ornate. It's sort of lusting after engaging this aesthetics. But at the same time, the Putinist state has always said, you can listen to the music you want to. You can watch the movies you want to, but we promise you'll always come back home. Because if you dabble too much, you will find yourself on the outside of society. You will find yourself degenerating in a way that threatens Russianness, threatens your family, threatens our national community. And that allows a lot of leeway for young people in Russia to experiment with art and with creativity in some ways, and also to believe that they're not really engaging in some grand state political project, because you don't have to be out there waving a banner with Putin's name on to engage in this sort of performance and this sort of behavior.
This outlook upon the youth, as you say, it's entirely shaped on social media. You say explicitly, reality is shaped on social media is real life. In your view, have the familiar contours of fascism latched itself onto a new generation of iPhone users and social media users? Or is there something unique about this moment? And is there something uniquely Russian about it?
I think we're beginning to see this form being exported to different countries around the world, whether deliberately on the part of the Russian state or whether it's being imitated by people watching from abroad. And I shall comment no more on that, otherwise we'll all get a lot of angry comments. But if we're talking about the familiar contours of fascism, then what we begin to see is a real difference from the fascisms of the past. In that traditionally, fascism has been spread through institutions, a party, secret police, schools. These are institutions that are very, very defined and restricted. You're a member or you're not of the party, the Nazi party. And, you could say the same of the totalitarianism, the other totalitarian movement of the 20th century, the communist movement, where being a party member was so important. But now we find that Russia doesn't have that sort of institution. Yes, the ruling party is United Russia, but it's not a mass membership party, and being a member doesn't really bring you any particular special benefits. What you see instead is a much more mass participatory movement. And thanks to the focus on aesthetics, and a lot of this comes from a guy called Surkov, who was Putin's sort of PR mastermind back in the 2000s. He really had the understanding of how the internet was going to change things and how mass culture could change things today. Anyone can participate at any time. You don't have to wait for the Monday night youth group, the Monday night rally. You don't have to be a member of the party, because you can always log on your smartphone. And before you know it, you can be posting, you can be writing comments, you can be liking, you can be sharing, you can find the same sense of mass affirmation that you used to have to go to a rally for at any time of day, 24/7. And the government is always there, and the government can always be pushing those messages, manipulating algorithms, and making sure that you see that content.
Regarding narratives, how do certain collective understandings occur? So, for instance, in Russia, you talk about the 1990s, how that was a period of struggle and rebirth, and maybe the people living through it didn't necessarily regard it as such at the time, but in hindsight, it comes to symbolize something. How do these narratives evolve? How does an entire population come to some kind of collective understanding about what things symbolize?
So the story of the 1990s in Russia is a really good example of how this sort of narrative could be created. So the early 1990s in Russia, and this is not often spoken of, and it hasn't often been spoken of in the last couple of years, was a time when the vast majority of Russians were keen to embrace Western liberal values, democracy, fairness, equality. Russia was very much a place that was open, that was in turmoil. There were lots of nationalists, including in the government, which made a big difference to the way that things played out over the subsequent years. But then, of course, the 1990s was also a period when life became bad for people, right? In a way that was pretty unimaginable just a few years before. And there was this sense, and there was a great author, Sergei Ushakin, who is either at Yale or Princeton, I think, and Ushakin's work is really, really good if anyone wants to check it out. He talks about the fact that Russians lost everything. Russia's turned into, I think he calls it a community of despair or a community of loss. The only thing people really had left to bond around was the idea that they'd lost something. What that was, of course, subject to contestation. Now, Putin recognized that at the turn of the millennium and realized that he could create a national narrative around the idea that we lived through the 1990s, we struggled through the 1990s as a sort of period of wandering through the desert, a trial or torment, and that he could establish himself as the opposite of this. That's something that we had to experience so that we could, live anew and enjoy the good times that Russians did live through in the 2000s. Not all Russians, of course, but many of them. And so very early in Putin's rule, we start to find more and more cultural productions, more and more references to the idea of this sort of what's called bespredel, the lawlessness. The bespredel is literally a sort of beyond the limit of the 1990s, where completely everything fell apart, not just economically but morally as well. And that allowed generally fascism and myth indeed more generally functions around alternating narratives of darkness and light, of death and life, and so on and so forth. So what we do is we create the opposing narrative. We had to die, we had to suffer, we had to go through the darkness to enjoy the light. And that ultimately is the patterning as well of the World War II myth that Putin has brought back. So we see all of these myths sort of dancing around each other in counterpoint as we constantly are reminded we had to suffer so that things could become good again.
One thing, as I'm reading this, I kept wondering, everything you're saying, how much of this is sort of stage managed by PRs who bring these things together and impose it on the population, and how much of it kind of rises up organically to sort of a collective inertia of understanding?
I think there is genuinely a combination of both in Russia. And what the Putin regime is so good at is not merely creating these narratives out of nothing, but recognizing where there is a seed of doubt, a seed of hatred, a seed of hope, and then just, watering that seed and nurturing it, pulling it out so that it always seems authentic. A good example would be, some people might have heard of the Immortal Regiment, this event that happens on Victory Day, the World War II commemoration every year, where people go out with images of their ancestors and parade through the streets and say, here's, thanks, Grandad, you died to save us today. And the Immortal Regiment was actually something that began in Siberia, in the city of Tomsk in the mid-2000s. And it purely was a grassroots initiative that was created by, I think, 3 local journalists. And I've actually spoken to one of them several times. And he's a really interesting guy, very, very thoughtful. He spoke to me about how this was a moment where, he saw that kids were beginning to forget what had happened during World War II, that Russia lived through a genuine crisis. All he wanted to do was sort of create the connection between the present generation and the past generation, which seems pretty innocent, to be honest. It's not, not too out there. And it really was their own idea. The state recognized this began to gather pace. It went down well. And now the Immortal Regiment happens all over the country. There are internet sites. It happens on Red Square. Putin takes part. And it doesn't belong to the original people at all. And in fact, that founder, Sergei Lapinkov, he rejects the whole thing now. And he says, I want nothing to do with it because this is not organic. It's not true anymore. It's just being foisted on the people.
Well, on that theme of things that start well with good intentions, but, evolve into something else. One of the topics that keeps coming up is leaders targeting these familiar enemies. So enemies of the family. I mean, this is by no means unique to Russia. You see this over Europe and the United States. Liberals, homosexuals, secularism generally. I'm curious how much of the party or leaders in charge disseminating this actually believe this, and how much of it is just to corral the population?
There are very few liberals hanging around in the Russian halls of power. Those that existed have been driven out or have been killed, or the lucky ones chose to leave, chose to get out before things got bad. But I would say that there is a deep homophobia within the Russian government. There is a deep xenophobia and nationalism. This stuff is not mere window dressing designed to control the population. And we've seen that around Putin over the last few years, there has been an increasing number of ideologues. And one of the folks I spoke to for the book, who's a civil servant, who was not too old, but said that, things have changed over the last few years. And I really see a new generation of civil servants entering the profession who are, I think, what he calls hurrah patriots, who's sort of, tub thumping, drum beating. Now, they may not represent the whole population, but if those are the people at the center of your political discourse, those are the people who have their hands on the levers of power and, of course, the levers of cultural production, you're going to end up with a culture that begins to self-perpetuate these sorts of values at some point.
One of my favorite passages is the following: even the most radicalized individuals I've spoken to care deeply for their families and communities. They are convinced that they are motivated by human goodness. The moderate patriots are drawn more to visions of family and home than fantasies of butchering Ukrainians. How does something like that get taken advantage of, I would say? Because it seems that these things we're talking about, Putin has a pressure point on this and knows how to manipulate it.
Probably the state's greatest success to date has been creating an environment in which the world is very clearly delineated into binaries. And this reflects that mythical sort of divide of darkness and light, incidentally. Binaries of us and them. We are X and they are Y, and they are homosexual, they are Jewish, they are Satanists, they are Western Democrats, corrupt, all of those things. Whereas we are Russian, Orthodox Christian, we are traditional values, which really means, we oppose the queer community in any way possible. And with its identification with goodness and family and home and community, the Russian state therefore says, whatever is on the outside, whatever belongs to the them, if you forgive some pretty bad grammar, whatever belongs to the them is inherently dangerous. And therefore we have these, and the passage that you're talking about, I think, relates to a young man called Vladislav, who's again, pretty hipster guy from Moscow, works in media production, should tick all the boxes. He's Jewish, should tick all the boxes for somebody who's a liberal anti-Putinist. And yet he is a fully paid up member of there is genocide against Russians in Donbass. And I remember just having this incredibly frustrating conversation with him at the end of our interview. It was one of the most striking moments of my research process, where I was asking, well, but what about the fact that, okay, well, if we ignore the fact of Donbass and whatever is happening there, but aren't Ukrainian people being killed by Russia in Ukraine? And the answer always is, no, you don't understand. Let me tell you about what's real. When we're on the outside, because we're part of the them, there is no way in this logic, if you can call it that, there is no way that we can understand anything that's happening on the inside. We don't understand Russians. And of course, it doesn't make sense. But if that's the belief, then that's what we have to deal with and engage with.
Your book includes many descriptions of, you alluded to this a moment ago, citizens in parades cheering on their soldiers. They become kind of a ritual, almost they almost have a kind of a religious connotation to them. In one scene, I remember you describe a video shared online by someone you interviewed, Alina, of Russians cheering off their troops to the front just a few miles from the border with Ukraine. People and military are drawn into a shared symbolic space, united around the military markings of Z and V that depicts support for the war. So what? We might say the same about any group of citizens cheering the boys off to the front. The RAF or the Stars and Stripes might as well stand in for Z or the Russian flag. How do we respond to Russians who just point the finger back and say, well, you guys have your heroes, you have your war myths. What's wrong with having heroes? Isn't it true that if you poke holes in any of these narratives, there's ultimately nothing but myths that these are predicated on?
I think when we look for ways to ultimately try to re-engage the Russian population, if we can imagine a few years down the road when Russia has withdrawn from Ukraine, when temperatures are lower, and there's a whole load of complexity into what that situation might look like. So bear with me. We have to recognize that war is a central part of reality, and most cultures do have war myths, and war myths are at the heart of most cultures. It's hard to find one that doesn't have that. And we have to encourage Russians to recognize that the sacrifices made during World War II were very real and very valuable. And yes, they did play a huge role in contributing to saving the world, really. Saving Western Europe from the Nazi threat, and that what happened on the territory of the Soviet Union was a genocide, yes, against Jewish people, but also against homosexuals, against Roma, against Slavs. And yet, the way that the Russian war myth has been twisted and turned by the state and by ultra-nationalists over the last 20 years is that war is an essential part of reality. The only way to perpetuate peace and perpetuate harmony is through more war. And that sacrifice is an essential part of life, and that somebody, especially young men, have to be violent and have to be willing to sacrifice themselves in order to be good and productive members of the community. And so the answer is to say, well, war can be a part of it and sacrifice can be a part of it from time to time, but that can't be the only thing. If you hold that up as the only and most important thing that can be done by a human being, then you will perpetuate this sort of violent conflict.
How do we distinguish between a healthy level of patriotism and nationalism?
I mean, it is a really tricky question, isn't it? And it's something that I kept coming back to, because there are some folks I interviewed for the book where, and you alluded to it in one of the quotations, where really all they're interested in is home and family, those very sort of, low-key patriotic values. I vaguely believe in the value of a culture and of a national community, and that in and of itself is not dangerous. Where things go overboard is when, again, that national community is created on a very sort of monovalent, in a very monovalent way, in the sense that there is only one kind of identity you can have. There's only one kind of person you can be, and that's where the line is probably crossed. Because if you do that, then inevitably you will create a culture in which you feel like you're always under attack, in which the culture is never quite as perfect as you want it to be, and therefore you leave the field open to the much more extreme nationalists who are promising these grand utopias of the past that we talked about.
One thing that is clear about Russian history is the worse things get, the more radical they become. From the outside, one might assume that as the standard of living declines, as corruption gets worse, people would become more disenchanted, but it seems we're seeing the opposite happen. How can we make sense of that apparent contradiction?
Simply put, the more people feel unstable, the more people feel threatened, the more their identities begin to fragment. And this happens in Russia with the state's own hand behind it. They deliberately fragment their own population. The more those people look for something that seems stable, something that seems harmonious. And it may well very, very well be the case that the stability and harmony that people look for is not in a turn to democratic liberal ideas, not in opposing or revolting against the people that are in charge, but in actually consuming those mythical narratives that a regime like the Putin regime is spreading, which promise that we can be great again, we can be stable again, everything will be harmonious if we can just fight this great war, but we'll always have to be ready to go to war. And yes, it doesn't make sense rationally, it's completely illogical. But that's what people want. They want certainty and stability.
Russia had a brief window of liberalism, the 1990s going through the 2000s. Then there was mass protests in the early 2010s and what seemed like a formidable opposition movement. But it seems like, at least in the West, as I'm reading this, I remember this 10 years ago. It seemed like, this is, it was part of the era of the Arab Spring. This is going to change everything. And there's all this enthusiasm kind of supporting it. But reading your book, it seems more like that was just a blip on the radar. Those initial protest movements, at least in the early 2010s. Is it time we start maybe changing our framework for how we view Russian culture instead of trying to imbue a sense of Western liberalism on it?
What I would say is this, that it is a mistake to assume that Russian culture is monolithic or is inherently violent or is inherently inclined to protest. Instead, these phenomena, these strands of reality can be pulled out, constructed and deconstructed. And when it comes to protest, what the opposition, if you can even speak of an opposition in Russia today, and in some senses you really can't because they're so disparate and so fragmented, what the state has done is painted, using these binaries of us and them, is painted all forms of opposition to the state's narratives around identity as being inherently not just dangerous to political stability, but to what we would call ontological stability, that is, the sense of identity, the sense of self that the culture, the community has. And the opposition today really lacks a strong narrative, any forms of alternatives that aren't tarred with the very dark brush, at least as it's seen in Russia, of liberalism, Westernism, and therefore the dread hand of Washington behind all of it. And consistently, we know from all forms of survey data, whether you look at anthropological research, cultural research, polling data, one of the strongest held beliefs and most widely held beliefs in Russia is a suspicion of the West, and in particular, a suspicion of America as a global power. And so you have to find, if you want to create that kind of protest movement once again, it can't be Alexei Navalny and his allies, as good as some of them, or as well as some of them are working. It can't be them saying, we're going to create a new democratic Russia.
When we talk about addressing this problem, I mean, whose problem is this to solve? And to the extent that we say things need to change, doesn't that just provide fodder for Russians who say that they're meddling in our affairs again?
I mean, the good news, if we're thinking about ways to intervene and support, in particular, young Russians, and it's tempting to say that, well, we're just going to ignore all of them. We're going to leave them to clean up their own mess. And many people do. But I'm thinking of, the ethnic minority Russians, the impoverished Russians, the queer Russians who really have no power, very little say, and are genuinely murdered and abused and oppressed in very deep ways. I think it's morally incumbent on us to help people like that, not just in Russia, but around the world. The good news is that they're already saying that we're meddling, that we're intervening. The state constantly tells the public that, whatever is happening is a CIA psyop. And you saw that earlier this week when there was the violent protest in Makhachkala airport in Dagestan, where a crowd of rioters broke into the airport looking for Jews to kill coming from a plane from Tel Aviv. And the state the next day immediately said the West was behind this, Kiev was behind this, the world is against us. And so whatever goes wrong in Russia is already blamed on the West. And therefore, it doesn't really matter if we're seen to be meddling, because we already are, in a sense.
All right, Dr. Garner, well, thank you for your time. Any last words on this subject that you should want to leave us with?
Just the book. The book is not a light read, but hopefully it's an engaging read. So I do hope that people go out and read it and find something useful in it.
Absolutely. We'll be sure to promote that. What's your next project?
I have just started writing a book about, it's provisionally going to be called Killing for Mother Russia. And it's going to be a history of why marginalized peoples have volunteered to fight for Russia, going from 1914 to the present.
All right. We'll be sure to look out for that. Well, again, I appreciate your time. I hope to keep in touch, and I wish you the best.
Cool. Cheers.
All right. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this interview, be sure to like and subscribe. Regimes Museum is a non-profit educational institution that studies the phenomenon of tyranny and dictatorship across history and culture. Find out more at www.regimes.museum.org.